I now call Keir Starmer, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank Sue Gray for the diligence and professionalism with which she's carried out her work.
The ground has cracked open beneath Britain's politics. A ruling so shocking, so earth-shattering, has torn through Westminster like a thunderclap. The Supreme Court has spoken, and its verdict is nothing less than a political earthquake. Keir Starmer's secret EU plot has been dragged into the light, exposed for what it truly was: a covert plan to pull Britain back under Brussels' grip, carried out behind closed doors, away from the eyes of Parliament, and hidden from the very people who voted for Brexit. This is not rumour, this is not speculation. This is Britain's highest court confirming, in plain black and white judgment, that the fears millions whispered in silence were real. And the fallout has only just begun. The Supreme Court has struck down Starmer's covert EU alignment plan in a decision described as nothing less than catastrophic for Labour's leadership. For months, whispers had swirled through the corridors of power. Whispers that Starmer, the man who promised respect for the Brexit vote, had been quietly stitching together backroom deals with Brussels. Whispers that he was embedding Britain into European regulatory frameworks without debate, without consent, without transparency. At every press conference, every interview, he dismissed it all as paranoia. He waved away the accusations as political theater, the desperate smears of rivals. But today, Britain's highest court has confirmed the truth. The judgment is devastating. Judges ruled that Starmer's secret agreements amounted to a constitutional breach, unlawful, unconstitutional, a direct violation of executive authority. According to the ruling, provisional frameworks had been signed tying Britain back into European standards. Agreements that carried the fingerprints of re-entry mechanisms, commitments that would have forced Britain to align with Brussels without a single vote in Parliament, without 1 ounce of democratic approval. The court's language cut like steel. This was not policy, this was betrayal. The ruling declared that no prime minister, no party leader, has the right to reshape the sovereignty of the nation in secret. The judgment stated clearly that Starmer's maneuvering was an abuse of delegated power, an attempt to sideline Parliament and bypass the people. For years, Britain had debated its future in the open, passionately, painfully, but transparently. Yet behind closed doors, Starmer had been steering the ship back to Europe in silence. Cloaked in technocratic language wrapped in words about stability and pragmatism, he was embedding Britain piece by piece into Brussels' orbit. The Supreme Court tore away that disguise. The fallout was immediate. Political rivals pounced like wolves circling prey. Nigel Farage thundered that this was proof Starmer had been caught red-handed in a mission to undo Brexit by stealth. Reform UK wasted no time branding Labour as traitors, unleashing a storm of slogans across social media. He lied, he signed, he betrayed. Even a fractured Conservative Party, sensing blood in the water, piled on. One senior Tory described Starmer as a rogue operator in a lawyer's costume, a brutal condemnation for a man who built his image on respect for the law. And the fury wasn't confined to rivals. Inside Labour itself, chaos erupted. Reports from party headquarters described an atmosphere of shock, panic, and near mutiny. Shadow cabinet members admitted privately that they were never told the full truth. They had been fed sanitized lines about rebuilding trust with Europe or regulatory pragmatism. But in reality, documents had been signed, commitments made, Britain's sovereignty quietly diluted in a betrayal that cut to the very heart of the Brexit mandate. Labour MPs representing Leave-leaning constituencies erupted with rage. To them, this was not a policy setback. It was political suicide. One furious backbencher was quoted saying, "We promised to respect Brexit. Instead, we look like liars. We look like traitors." Another warned bluntly that voters would never forgive what they now saw as a deliberate deception. For many, this was not just the collapse of a plan. It was the collapse of trust, the shattering of the image Starmer had spent years polishing. The steady lawyer, the man of rules, the leader of order. Now that image lay in ruins. The Supreme Court had not merely dismantled his plan, it had exposed him. A leader operating in the shadows, treating Parliament as an obstacle, treating voters as irrelevant. And as the truth spread like wildfire across the nation, one question echoed louder than all the rest. Can Keir Starmer ever be trusted again? If the ruling itself was a legal earthquake, the aftermath was the political aftershock, and it threatened to rip the foundations of Labour apart. Almost as soon as the Supreme Court's judgment hit the airwaves, the leaks began. Confidential memos, strategy papers, and internal emails, some stamped highly sensitive, poured out of Labour's headquarters and into the hands of journalists and rivals. Each document was a dagger, and together they painted a picture of a leadership consumed by secrecy. One memo in particular electrified the media cycle. A step-by-step plan, signed off by senior advisors, detailing how to harmonize Britain's trade and regulatory frameworks with the European Union. Buried within the dense jargon of regulatory convergence and framework reintegration was a chilling instruction: avoid legislative routes, keep communication vague, and minimize public announcements. In plain words, Starmer's advisors had recommended deception. MPs were to be fed carefully crafted soundbites about economic stability, while civil servants quietly wove EU regulations back into British law. This was not transparency. This was concealment, engineered from the very top. The leaks detonated inside Labour like a bomb. Backbench MPs who had long harbored doubts about Starmer's instincts erupted with fury. For those representing Leave-voting constituencies, the revelations were not just embarrassing, they were political death sentences. One angry MP spat out the words, "I didn't sign up for a secret rejoiner mission. This is betrayal, plain and simple." Another warned, "We will lose the next election if we don't cut this rot out right now." The phrase political suicide began to echo through Labour corridors, and calls for an emergency meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party grew louder by the hour. The crisis soon hit the very top of the party. Angela Rayner, Starmer's deputy, was dragged into the storm. According to insiders, she confronted him in a behind-closed-doors showdown, demanding to know how such a monumental operation could have been carried out without her knowledge or oversight. Reports suggested she left the meeting livid, convinced she had been deceived and politically undermined. The fragile bridge Starmer had promised to build between Labour's technocratic elite and its working-class representatives now looked ready to snap in two. Outside Labour, the feeding frenzy was merciless. Conservatives, despite their own fractured state, gleefully weaponized the leaks. They branded Starmer as a leader who viewed Parliament as an inconvenience and voters as fools. Nigel Farage roared that the ruling had unmasked the greatest conspiracy of modern politics, an attempt to resubjugate Britain to Brussels. Reform UK went on the attack with blistering speed, plastering the internet with slogans like "He lied, he signed, he betrayed." Hashtags like #Brexit betrayal and #Starmer exposed spread like wildfire, trending nationwide within hours. Labour's media machine tried to fight back, but every line of spin collapsed under the sheer weight of documentary evidence now circulating in public view. The damage was unstoppable. And then came the scholars, the lawyers, the constitutional experts, all piling on with their verdicts. Analysts picked apart the leaked documents and the Supreme Court judgment with clinical precision. Their conclusions were brutal. This was not a technical mistake, not a bureaucratic misstep, but a deliberate, systemic attempt to sidestep democratic accountability. One constitutional scholar declared it the most serious breach of parliamentary norms in living memory. Another warned that the judgment now set a binding precedent. No government could ever again commit Britain to international frameworks of this scale without explicit parliamentary approval. Ironically, in his attempt to quietly realign Britain with Brussels, Starmer had weakened his own office, stripping future prime ministers of powers he had once hoped to exploit. The final blow in this second wave came from within. Whistleblowers, emboldened by the ruling and the leaks, began speaking out. Former staffers painted a damning picture of a leadership obsessed with optics and terrified of scrutiny. They described an internal culture where staff were ordered to avoid emails that might leak, to cloak discussions and euphemisms, and to brief MPs with only the bare minimum of information. "We knew if the public saw the truth, they would never forgive us," one whistleblower admitted. But the leadership pressed ahead anyway. These revelations confirmed what millions suspected. This was not negligence. This was intent, and that intent was now laid bare for all to see. If the leaks had cracked the foundations of Keir Starmer's leadership, his attempt at damage control shattered what little remained. Under growing pressure from his own MPs, from furious voters, and from relentless media coverage, Starmer finally stepped in front of the cameras to address the nation. But instead of steadying the ship, his press conference became the defining moment of collapse, a performance so tone-deaf, so robotic, that it only deepened the crisis. The event was hastily arranged, staged in a sterile conference room that reeked of desperation. Starmer stepped up to the podium with a fixed expression, clutching a prepared script like a lifeline. His voice was flat, his words carefully chosen but lifeless, as he denied any wrongdoing. He insisted that the covert EU alignment plan had been designed only to protect British jobs and maintain competitiveness in a global economy. He dismissed the Supreme Court's ruling as nothing more than a clarification. And when journalists pressed him with questions about the leaked documents, papers signed by his own advisors that explicitly recommended secrecy and deception, Starmer brushed them aside with mechanical replies, repeating the same empty lines until the room grew restless. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Broadcasters cut away from his speech only to unleash panels of legal experts and political commentators, nearly all united in their verdict: evasive, arrogant, dismissive. Newspapers ran headlines dripping with fury. He lied, he denied, he betrayed. Social media turned savage within minutes. Clips of his most awkward responses spread like wildfire, racking up millions of views. One viral post summed up the national mood in 7 damning words: he lied, he got caught, he's pretending. Instead of diffusing the crisis, Starmer's performance poured petrol on the fire. Labour MPs, already shaken by the Supreme Court judgment and the damning leaks, now saw their leader compounding the disaster with his refusal to show humility or contrition. Behind closed doors, panic turned to open rebellion. Backbench MPs began openly discussing a no-confidence motion. Few believed it could succeed immediately, but the symbolism alone would be catastrophic, a sign that Labour's own ranks had lost faith in their leader. Names of potential successors began to swirl in Westminster gossip circles: West Streeting, Lisa Nandy, even Angela Rayner, though she herself was seething after being kept in the dark. For the first time, Labour's leadership looked not just bruised but broken, its authority draining away in real time. Meanwhile, investigative journalists refused to relent, digging deeper into the scandal. Reports surfaced of clandestine meetings between Labour officials and EU representatives, not in official venues, but in discreet hotels and embassies across Europe. The agendas of these meetings, according to sources, included plans to synchronize environmental standards, restore recognition agreements, and align digital trade rules. In one particularly explosive revelation, British negotiators were said to have proposed rejoining an EU regulatory agency under the title of Strategic Observer, a cosmetic disguise that would, in practice, still force Britain to comply with EU rules without a single parliamentary vote. Each revelation grew darker, each detail more damning than the last. This was no one-off blunder, no miscommunication, no bureaucratic mistake. It was a systemic operation, carefully crafted and deliberately hidden from the public. Civil servants with long ties to Brussels had been embedded within key departments. Former EU lawyers had been quietly recruited as advisors. Layer upon layer, the machinery of realignment had been built in silence until the Supreme Court tore it open. And the British people, long suspicious of backroom deals and technocratic schemes, reacted with fury. Overnight polls showed Labour's commanding lead collapsing like a house of cards. Swing voters fled in droves. Leave supporters who had cautiously drifted back to Labour abandoned the party en masse. Reform UK capitalised instantly, launching its Stop the Rejoiners campaign with nationwide rallies, petitions, and a fundraising blitz. Nigel Farage declared the scandal the final unmasking of Labour's betrayal, while Conservative MPs hammered home the message that Starmer was unfit to govern and too weak to be trusted with sovereignty. Inside Labour HQ, the atmosphere turned toxic. Staff described frantic efforts to scrub records, sleepless nights spent huddling with legal teams, and whispered discussions of resignation to avoid being dragged down with the sinking ship. Some advisors clung to the hope that Starmer could survive. Others quietly admitted that the damage was irreparable. And as the dust from his disastrous press conference refused to settle, the real tremors began inside Labour itself.
What had started as grumbling among backbenchers was now erupting into open defiance. Whispers of outright mutiny filled the air. One senior MP put it bluntly: "We cannot go into an election with this hanging over us, because the voters will crucify us." The Labour Party, once united behind its polished lawyer leader, was splintering before his eyes. The rebellion had begun and there was no turning back. The rebellion inside Labour exploded like a pressure cooker at breaking point. What had begun as whispers in corridors now erupted into full-blown mutiny. MPs gathered in tense, unscheduled meetings, their anger no longer contained. The leaked strategy documents had already poisoned trust, but Starmer's robotic press conference pushed many over the edge. For backbenchers representing Leave-voting constituencies, the scandal was nothing short of a political death sentence. Their phones were ringing off the hook, flooded with furious messages from constituents who felt betrayed, deceived and humiliated. One MP, close to tears, admitted privately, "We can't knock on doors anymore. People see us as liars. They see us as traitors." Others warned openly that if Starmer remained in place, Labour would walk into the next election carrying a noose around its neck. Angela Rayner, once the loyal deputy and bridge between Labour's elite and its working-class base, now found herself at the epicentre of the storm. Reports claimed she was furious, telling allies that Starmer had treated the party like a closed clique, run by a handful of advisers obsessed with secrecy and contemptuous of MPs. She accused the leadership of locking her out of the most consequential political operation in modern history. To her supporters, she was the authentic voice of Labour's grassroots, a straight talker, a fighter, someone who could reconnect with the betrayed Red Wall. To her enemies, she was now a threat, a rival who might seize the moment. The whispers grew louder. Could Rayner be the one to lead Labour out of the wreckage? Though she played cautious in public, insiders said she was torn between loyalty and survival, knowing that standing too close to Starmer might destroy her with him. Meanwhile, Labour's polling numbers went into freefall. Red Wall constituencies, already sceptical, slipped further out of reach. Focus groups described Starmer with venomous words: liar, cheat, traitor. One strategist, grim-faced, admitted privately, "This is worse than the Corbyn years. At least then people knew what they were getting. Now they think we've lied to them." The Conservative Party pounced, with Tory MPs filling the airwaves, hammering home the line that Starmer was finished, untrustworthy and reckless. Reform UK escalated its offensive, launching digital billboards across the country with slogans like "Starmer's secret deal, Brexit betrayal," and "He lied, he signed, he tried to rejoin." Nigel Farage demanded Starmer's immediate resignation, calling for every communication with Brussels to be made public. The atmosphere in Britain's politics had turned toxic, and Labour's leader was at the centre of the storm. But the betrayal was so grave that even Labour's allies began to retreat. Trade unions demanded answers, refusing to back a leader they now saw as compromised. Momentum, once the beating heart of Labour's activist base, released a blistering statement accusing Starmer of undermining democracy and spitting on the Brexit referendum. Even traditionally sympathetic media outlets like The Guardian and prominent left-leaning commentators, usually cautious in their criticism, now questioned his honesty and his judgment. The protective shield that once surrounded him had shattered completely. Historical comparisons poured in. Some likened his downfall to Tony Blair after Iraq, a leader whose secrecy and arrogance corroded trust until authority crumbled. Others reached further back, drawing parallels to the 17th century crises when rulers tried to govern without parliament and plunged Britain into chaos. A historian warned grimly, "Every time a leader treats parliament as an inconvenience, disaster follows. Starmer is just the latest chapter in that story." And so, the question that had haunted Westminster from the first moment of the Supreme Court's ruling now grew deafening. Could Keir Starmer survive? The names of possible successors swirled like vultures circling above. Wes Streeting, the ambitious young contender, touted as a fresh face who could reset Labour's broken image. Lisa Nandy, respected as a unifier who could appeal to both metropolitan voters and the Red Wall. And Angela Rayner, unpredictable but authentic, with the working-class credibility that Starmer never possessed. The knives were being sharpened, but no one dared make the first strike, yet. The countdown had begun. The rebellion was no longer a question of if, it was only a matter of when. And as Britain watched its opposition party implode in real time, one chilling reality became clear. The Supreme Court had not just shattered Starmer's secret EU plot. It had unleashed a political firestorm that could consume his leadership, his party, and perhaps even the future of Brexit itself.